The Other Wiseman by Henry Van Dyke, edited by Ralph and Marnie Powell, are faculty advisors for the Christian Student Fellowship at Minneapolis Community College in downtown Minneapolis. You know the story of the three wise men of the East, how they traveled from far away to offer their gifts at the manger cradle in Bethlehem. But have you heard the story of the other wise man, who also saw the star and set out to follow, yet did not arrive with his brethren in the presence of the young child Jesus? Of that great desire of this fourth pilgrim, how it was denied, yet accomplished in the denial, and of his many wanderings, and of the long way of his seeking, and of the strange way of his finding the one whom he sought. Here is the story of the other wise man. You have come tonight, said Artaban, looking at his friends, to renew your worship and rekindle your faith in the God of purity. Hear me, my friends, while I tell you of the new light and truth that have come to me through the most ancient of all signs, the stars. He drew from his tunic 2 small rolls of fine parchment and unfolded them carefully. In the years that are lost to the past, there were wise men in Chaldea, from whom the first Magi learned the secret of the heavens. Hear their prophecy. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall arise out of Israel. It has been shown to me and to my 3 companions among the Magi, Caspar, Melchior, and Belthazzar. We have searched the ancient tablets of the Chaldeans and computed the time. We have studied the sky. And in the spring of the year, we saw 2 of the great planets draw together in the sign of the fish, which is the house of the Hebrews. We also saw a new star there, which shone for 1 night and then vanished. Now again, the 2 great planets are meeting. This is the night of their conjunction. My 3 brothers are watching by the ancient temple of the 7 spheres, and I am watching here. And if the star shines again, then we will wait 10 days. And we will set out together for Jerusalem to see and worship the promised one who shall be born King of Israel. I believe the sign will come. I have made ready for the journey. I have sold my possessions. I bought these 3 jewels, a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl, to carry them as tribute to the king. And I ask you to go with me on the pilgrimage, that we may have joy together in finding the prince who is worthy to be served. But his friends looked on with strange and alien eyes. A veil of doubt and mistrust came over their faces. They glanced at each other with looks of wonder and pity, as those who have listened to an incredible saying, the story of a wild vision, proposal of an impossible enterprise. Each excused himself from the journey, and one by one they left the house of Artaban. But the oldest, and the one who loved him the best, lingered after the others. He said gravely, "My son, it may be that the light of truth is in this sign that has appeared in the skies, and then it will surely lead to the prince. Or it may be that it is only a shadow of the light, and then he who follows it will have a long pilgrimage and a fruitless search. But it is better to follow the eyes even of a shadow than to remain in the content with the worst. And those who would see wonderful things must often be ready to travel alone. I am too old for this journey, but my heart shall be a companion for your pilgrimage day and night. Go in peace." Then he went out to the chamber, and Artaban was left in solitude. For a long time he stood and watched the flame that flickered and sank upon the altar. Then he crossed the hall and went out to the pillars to the terrace of the roof. The shiver that had run through the earth before she rouses from her night sleep had already begun. The cool wind that heralds the daybreak was drawing downward. Birds, half awake, crept and chirped among the rustling leaves. Far on the eastern plain a white mist stretched like a lake. But where the distant peaks of the mountains serrated the western horizon, the sky was clear. Jupiter and Saturn rolled together like drops of flame about to blend into one. As Artaban watched, a steel blue spark was born out of the darkness beneath, rounding itself with purple splendors to a crimson sphere, spiring upwards through the rays of saffron and orange into a point of white radiance. Tiny, infinitely remote, yet perfect, it pulsated in the enormous vault as if 3 jewels in his girdle had mingled and been transformed into a living heart of light. He bowed his head. He covered his brow with his hands. "It is the sign," he said. "The king is coming. I will go to meet him." Artaban rode swiftly until he arrived at nightfall on the 10th day beneath the scattered walls of Babylon. His horse was almost spent. Artaban would gladly have turned into the city to find rest, but he knew that it was 3 hours' journey yet to the temple of the 7 spheres, and that he must reach the place by midnight if he would find his comrades waiting. So he did not halt, but he rode steadily across to the stubble fields. A grove of date palms made an island of gloom in the pale yellow sea. As she passed into the shadow, the horse slackened her pace, began to pick her way more carefully. Near the farther end of the darkness, caution seemed to fall upon her. She scented some danger, some difficulty. It was not in her heart to fly from it, only to be prepared for it, to meet it wisely, as a good horse should do. She felt her steps before her delicately, carrying her head low, At last she saw a quick breath and stood stock still, quivering before a dark object in the shadow of the palm tree. Artaban dismounted. The dim starlight revealed the form of a man lying across the road. His humble dress and the outline of his haggard face showed that he was probably one of the Hebrews who still dwelt in great numbers around the city. His pallid skin bore the mark of a deadly fever. The chill of death was in his lean hand, and as Artaban released it, the arm fell back inertly upon the motionless breast. He turned away with a thought of pity, leaving the body to that strange burial with which the Magians deemed most fitting, the funeral of the desert, from which the kites and the vultures rise on dark wings and the beasts of prey slink away. When they are gone, there is only a heap of white bones. But as he turned, a long, faint, ghostly sigh came from the man's lips. The bony fingers gripped to the hem of Artaban's robe. He held him fast. Artaban's heart leaped to his throat, not with fear, but with resentment at the importunity of this blind delay. How could he stay here in the darkness to minister to a dying stranger? What claim had this unknown fragment of human life upon his compassion, upon his service? If he lingered but for an hour, he could hardly reach the temple at the appointed time. His companions would think he had given up the journey and would go on without him. He would lose his quest. But if he went on now, the man would surely die. If Artaban stayed, the life might be restored. His spirit throbbed and fluttered with the urgency of the crisis. Should he risk the great reward of his faith for the sake of a single deed of charity? Should he turn aside, if only for a moment, from following of the star to give a cup of cold water to a poor, perishing Hebrew? God of truth and purity, he prayed, direct me in the holy path, the way of wisdom which you only know. Then he turned back to the sick man. Loosening the grasp of his hand, he carried him to a little mound at the foot of the palm tree. He unbound the thick folds of his turban and opened the garment above the sunken breast. He brought water from one of the small canals. He moistened the sufferer's brow and mouth. He mingled a draught of one of those simple but potent remedies which he always carried in his girdle, for which the Magians were physicians as well as astrologers, and poured it slowly between the colorless lips. Hour after hour he labored as only a skillful healer of disease can do, and at last the man's strength returned. He sat up and looked about him. "Who are you?" he said in the rude dialect of that country, "and why have you sought to bring back my life?" "I am Artaban, the Magian, and I am going to Jerusalem in search of the one who is born King of the Jews, a great prince and deliverer of all men. I dare not delay any longer upon my journey, for the caravan that has waited for me may depart without me. But see, here is all I have left of bread and wine and a portion of my healing herbs. And when your strength is restored, you shall find dwellings of Hebrews among the houses of Babylon." The Jew raised his trembling hand slowly to heaven. "Now may the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob bless and prosper the journey of the merciful, and bring him peace in his desired haven. Stay, I have nothing to give you in return, only this, for I can tell you where the Messiah must be sought. For our prophets have said that he should be born not in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem of Judah. May the Lord bring thee safely to that place, because you have had pity upon the sick." It was already long past midnight. Artaban rode in haste, and his horse, restored by the brief rest, ran eagerly. But the first beam of the rising sun sent a long shadow before her as she entered upon the final stadium of her journey, and the eyes of Artaban, anxiously scanning the horizon of the Temple of the Seven Spheres, could discern no trace of his friends. Artaban rode swiftly around the hill. He dismounted and climbed to the highest terrace, looking out toward the west. At the edge of the terrace, he saw a little cairn of broken bricks, and under them a piece of papyrus. He caught it up and read, "We have waited past midnight. We can delay no longer. We go to find the king. Follow us across the desert." Artaban sat down and covered his head in despair. "How can I cross the desert?" he said. "No food, a spent horse. I must return to Babylon, sell my sapphire, buy a train of camels and provision for the journey. I may never overtake my friends. Only God the merciful knows whether I shall not lose sight of the king because I tarried to show mercy." It was the third day after the wise men had come to Bethlehem and had found Mary and Joseph with the young child Jesus, had laid their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh at his feet. Then the other wise men drew near, wary, but full of hope, bearing his ruby and his pearl to offer to the king. "For now at last I shall surely find him. Though I be alone and later than my brethren, this is the place which the Hebrew exile told me that the prophets had spoken. And here I shall behold the rising of the great light. But I must inquire about the visit of my brethren, and to what house the star directed them, and to whom they presented their tribute." The streets of the village seemed deserted, and Artaban wondered whether the man who had gone up to the hill pastures to bring down their sheep. From the open door of a cottage, he heard the sound of a woman's voice singing softly. He entered and found a young mother hushing her baby to rest. She told him of the strangers from the east who had appeared in the village 3 days ago, and how they had said that a star had guided them to the place where Joseph of Nazareth was lodging with his wife, and how they had paid reverence to the child and given him many rich gifts. But the travelers disappeared again, she continued, as suddenly as they had come. We were afraid of the strangeness of their visit. We could not understand it. The man of Nazareth took the child and his mother and fled away that night secretly. It was whispered that they were going to Egypt. Ever since, there has been a spell upon the village and something evil hangs over it. They say that Roman soldiers are coming to force a new tax on us, and the men have driven the flocks and herds far back into the hills and hidden themselves to escape it. Artaban listened to her gentle, timid speech, and the child in her arms looked up at his face and smiled, stretching out his rosy hands to him. His heart warmed to the touch. It seemed like a greeting of love and trust to one who had journeyed long in loneliness and perplexity, fighting his own doubts and fears, following a light that was veiled in clouds. Why might not this child have been the privileged prince, he asked within himself. Kings have been born in lowlier houses than this, and the favorite of the stars may even rise from a cottage, but it has not seemed good to the God of heaven to reward my search so soon and so easily. The one whom I seek has gone before me, and I must follow to Egypt. The young mother laid the baby in its cradle and rose to minister to the wants of the strange guest that fate had brought into her house. She set food before him, plain fare of peasants, willingly offered, and therefore full of refreshment for the soul as well as for the body. Artaban accepted it gratefully and ate. The child fell into a happy slumber, murmured sweetly in its dreams, and great peace filled the room. But suddenly there came a noise of wild confusion in the streets of the village, a shrieking and wailing of women's voices, a clamor of brazen trumpets, a clashing of swords, and the desperate cry, "The soldiers, they're killing our children." The young mother's face grew white with terror. She clasped her child in her bosom, crouched motionless in the darkest corner of the room, and covered him with the folds of her robe, lest he should wake and cry. But Artaban went quickly and stood at the doorway of the house. His broad shoulders filled the portal from side to side, and the peak of his white cap all but touched the lintel. The soldiers came hurrying down the street with bloody hands and dripping swords. At the sight of the stranger in his opposing dress, they hesitated. The captain approached the threshold to thrust him aside, but Artaban did not stir. His face was as calm as though he were watching the stars. He held up the soldiers silently, then said in a low voice, "I'm all alone in this place, and I'm waiting to give this jewel to the prudent captain who will leave me in peace." He showed the ruby glistening in the hollow of his hand like a great drop of blood. The captain was amazed at the splendor of the gem. The pupils of his eyes expanded with desire, and the hard lines of greed wrinkled around his lips. He stretched out his hand. He took the ruby. The clamor and clang of the arms passed by down the street. Artaban re-entered the cottage. He turned his face to the east and prayed, "God of truth, forgive my sin. For I've said a thing that is not to save the life of a child. And 2 of my gifts are gone. I've spent for man that which was meant for God. I shall never be worthy to see the face of the king." But the voice of the woman weeping for joy in the shadow behind him said very gently, "But you have saved the life of my little one. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you, and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you, and give you peace." 33 years of the life of Artaban had passed away, and he was still a pilgrim, a seeker after light. His hair, once dark, was now white as the wintry snow. His eyes that once flashed like flames of fire were dull as embers smoldering among the ashes. Worn and weary and ready to die, but still looking for the king, he had come for the last time to Jerusalem. He had often visited the city before. He had searched all its lanes and crowded hovels and black prisons without finding any trace of the family of the Nazarenes who had fled from Bethlehem so long ago. But now it seemed as if he must make one more effort, and something whispered in his heart that at last he might succeed. It was the season of Passover. The city was thronged with strangers. The children of Israel, scattered in far lands, had returned to the temple for the great feast, and there had been a confusion of languages in the narrow streets for many days. But on this last day, a singular agitation was visible in the multitude. The sky was veiled with a portentous gloom. Currents of excitement seemed to flash through the crowd. A secret tide was sweeping them all one way, the clatter of sandals and the soft, thick sound of thousands of bare feet shuffling over the stones, floating ceaselessly down the streets that lead to the Damascus Gate. Artaban joined a group of people from his own country, Parthian Jews who had come up for the Passover, and he inquired among them, what is the cause of the tumult? Where were they going? We are going, they answered, to the place called Golgotha, outside the city, where there is to be an execution. Have you not heard what has happened? 2 famous robbers are to be crucified, and with them another called Jesus of Nazareth, a man who's done many wonderful works among the people, so that they might love him greatly. But the priests and the elders have said he must die, because he gave himself out to be the Son of God. And Pilate has sent him to the cross because he said he was King of the Jews. How strangely these familiar words fell upon the tired heart of Artaban. They had led him for a lifetime over land and sea, and now they had come to him mysteriously like a message of despair. The king had arisen, but he had been denied and cast out. He was about to perish. Perhaps he was already dying. Could it be the same one who had been born in Bethlehem 33 years ago, at whose birth the star had appeared in the heavens, and of whose coming the prophets had spoken? Artaban's heart beat unsteadily with that troubled, doubtful apprehension which is the excitement of old age. But he said within himself, the ways of God are stranger than the thoughts of man, and it may be that I shall find the king at last in the hands of his enemies, and shall come in time to offer my pearl for a ransom before he dies. So the old man followed the multitude with slow and painful steps toward the Damascus Gate of the city. Just beyond the entrance of that guardhouse, a troop of Macedonian soldiers came down the street, dragging a young girl with torn dress and disheveled hair. As the Magian passed, he paused. He looked at her with compassion. She broke suddenly from the hands of her tormentors and threw himself at his feet, clasping him around the knees. Have pity on me, she cried, and save me for the sake of the God of purity. I am a daughter of the true religion which is taught by the Magi. My father is a merchant of Parthia, but he is dead, and I am seized for his debts and to be sold as a slave. Save me from a fate worse than death. Artaban trembled. It was the old conflict in his soul, which had come to him in the palm grove of Babylon and in the cottage of Bethlehem, the conflict between the expectation of faith and the impulse of love. Twice the gift which he had consecrated to the worship of the religion had been drawn to the service of humanity. This was the third trial, the ultimate probation, the final, the irrevocable choice. Was it his great opportunity or his last temptation? He could not tell. One thing only was clear in the darkness of his mind. It was inevitable. And does not the inevitable come from God? One thing only was sure to his divided heart. To rescue this helpless girl would be a true deed of love. And is not love the light of the soul? So he took the pearl from his bosom. Never had it seemed so luminous, so radiant, so full of tender, living luster. He laid it in the hand of the slave. This is thy ransom, daughter. It is the last of my treasures which I kept for the king. While he spoke, the darkness of the sky deepened, and shuddering tremors ran through the earth. The walls of the houses rocked to and fro. Stones were loosened. They crashed into the street. Dust clouds filled the air. Soldiers fled in terror, reeling like drunken men. But Artaban and the girl whom he had ransomed crouched helpless beneath the wall of the praetorium. What had he to fear? What had he to hope? He had given away the last remnant of his tribute for the king. He had parted with the last hope of finding. The quest was over, and it had failed. But even in that thought, accepted and embraced, there was peace. For it was not resignation, it was not submission. It was something more profound and searching. He knew that all was well, because he had done the best he could do day to day. He had been true to the light that had been given him. He had looked for more. And if he had not found it, it was a failure that did not come out of his life. Doubtless, that was the best life that was possible. He knew that even if he could live his earthly life over again, it would not be otherwise. One more lingering pulsation of the earthquake quivered through the ground. A heavy tile, shaken from the roof, fell and struck the old man on the temple. He lay breathless and pale, with his gray head resting on the young girl's shoulder. As she bent over, fearing he was dead, there came a voice through the twilight, very small, still, like music sounding from a distance, in which the notes are clear but the words are lost. The girl turned to see if someone had spoken from a window above, but she saw no one. Then the old man's lips began to move as if in answer, and she heard him say, in the Parthian tongue, "Not so, my lord. For when did I see you hunger and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When saw I you a stranger and took you in, or naked and clothed you? When did I see you sick or in prison and come to you? 33 years I've looked for you, but I've never seen your face, nor ministered to you, my king." He ceased, and the sweet voice came again. And again the maid heard it, very faint, very far away. But now it seemed as though she understood the words. "Verily, I say to you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me." A calm radiance of wonder and joy lighted the pale face of Artaban, like the first ray of dawn on a snowy mountain peak. A long breath of relief exhaled gently from his lips. His journey had ended. His treasures were accepted. The other wise men had found the king.